Hey friends, and welcome back to another Mayhem Toolkit video. Today we're gonna talk all things accessory. And I know you're already thinking it. I don't wanna listen to anything about accessory. I wanna come in, do my strength work, do my Metcon, and get out of there. But the reality is that if you have a good coach, they're writing accessory work to make sure that you're actually getting better at the margins of your experience. And that's what CrossFit is all about. We're trying to identify your limitations and get you better at those things so that we can raise your ceiling and get you better at the sport. And we have a system that we use at Mayhem to build in accessory work. So I'll let Jake kind of introduce these concepts and then we'll walk through each one.
That's why Brandon does the intros and not me. So to dive into it, a little bit more context. This was born out of some conversations I was having with coaches. I was looking at their programs, some of the coaches that we mentor in our mentorship group, and then even conversations like Brandon mentioned with athletes, where a lot of times we throw the word accessory around a lot, and I start to get a little bit, I don't know, I've become a little annoyed with that term, because as soon as you say accessory, people think it's not the meat and potatoes, it's not all that meaningful. And when it's not meaningful, we really never truly start to understand how to use it effectively, whether you're a coach or an athlete. So we want to go back to the same model or framework that we always think about when we're thinking about where do we start with our training. And we owe Brandon credit to using a lot of this language. If we look at the board, we're thinking about where do we start with our movements? Where do we start with our training? Well, it's what do we lack? Number one, do we lack access? Or in other words, do we lack mobility, flexibility, or just overall range of motion? Okay. Number two, let's say we have good mobility or we have range of motion. Do we lack control? So we can get into a perfect bottom of the squat, but we're a little kind of wobbly or shaky when we get there. A good example too would be like a ring dip, right? Somebody could have the range of motion in their chest and their shoulders, and they get in a good position, but they're pressing up on the rings and they're shaking all over the place. So they lack stability. Okay. And then number three is once you have range of motion, you have control, they need to master the movement, right? So they really need to create the most movement efficiency or movement economy. So let's go back to the ring dip. I've got good control, but I just lack stamina, right? So I can only do 2 or 3 reps with great control, but I need to be able to do 10, 12, 15, whatever that might be to perform at the level I need to perform at. So the same way we think about where we start with our programming here and where we start with just overall access, control, or mastery is how we want to start thinking about accessory. Do we need to use accessory to improve access, control, or master a particular movement?
Yeah, I think again, they're like the way that you think about this framework is we are going through this process of improving movement quality and then movement endurance so that you can do the things that you like. Most people come in, they're like, hey, I want to crush this Metcon, and they keep doing Metcons to get better at Metcons, which is one way to do it. But you're going to hit your ceiling at some point if you don't improve the movement quality. In other words, being more efficient at how you move so you're using less effort per rep than your peers, because that's the name of the game in CrossFit. It's all for time or for reps. And so in our accessory work, we can start to build this framework to think about how do we get our athletes moving better, how do we get our athletes stabilizing those positions, and then how do we get our athletes to actually endure in those positions so that they can express them in the sport. And so when we start with access, anytime I have an athlete come on, or maybe an athlete I've been with for years and years, the first question I'm always asking is, can they move into the ranges of motion that are required for the sport? And so maybe they're on a back squat progression or a squat snatch progression or a handstand push-up progression. The first thing I'm looking at is, are we getting into quality positions where they can express the force that's needed for that movement? And the question is, okay, well, what actually improves their range of motion? So when we're going through accessory work, I want to think about what improves the range of motion first before I even get into the control or the stability side. And there's kind of 4 examples. There's many more that you could go through as a coach or as an athlete, but these are 4 that I use all the time, and I know that Jake uses them all the time in his programming. The first one is the most obvious, which is just passive stretching. Now, there is some research out there that passive stretching is only good for passive stretching. So you have to go past this at some point. You got to learn how to get into those deeper end ranges where you're loading, or you're doing some pels and rails style work or dynamic mobility. But that's a good place to start, especially if you haven't done a lot of mobility ever in your life, which I was guilty of when I was playing football in college. Then we can move down the chain and say, okay, now we want to start to actually try to control those end ranges by doing some loaded stretching, force ourselves into some deeper end ranges. You think about the athletes that have really struggled getting their arms overhead, doing some loaded stretching work where maybe you grab onto something or hold a dumbbell or kettlebell overhead while you're on a foam roller is a really good way to start moving into deeper positions so you can get full shoulder flexion. Another one that we use is functional range conditioning. I just put the acronym there. This, if you have not heard of it, go on YouTube and check out Andrea Ospina's stuff. He's one of the best when it comes to in range of motion and mobility in all sports. He works with a lot of high-level athletes, and this is something that I know that Jake and I use all the time in our programs. The concept is that you're going to do a passive stretch into a progressive angular isometric load, which I know is very complicated, but I promise you watch the video, it's super simple. And then you go into a regressive angular isometric loading. And what it does is it's not only opening up those in ranges, but now you're actually learning how to control those in ranges, which is that next step in accessory work. What this will do for you is you not only gain more in range, but now you have kind of that mind-body connection to actually get into the in range over and over again when you need it in a CrossFit setting. And then the last one would be more of your dynamic mobility. You could do some ballistic mobility work or more speed-based mobility work, especially for the Olympic lifts. That's a great way to improve your range of motion. Jake, you got any thoughts on that one?
No, I would just say nobody thinks this way, right? Like when we think about accessory work, I'm trying to think about myself again. Squat, I suck at squatting. I think I've talked about that before in the Toolkit videos. I make it very known and apparent. I never take the time to think about, I always jump right to how can I improve muscle endurance and strength in my squat. But I never think about, man, could I get better access? Could I actually have better range of motion in my squat, in my ankles, in my hips? The answer now is yes, with all the running I've been doing. I would improve my squat in the long run by taking time to think about accessory work, incorporating that into my training just to improve access. Because like Brandon mentioned before, if I don't do that at the beginning, if I don't start there, I'm always gonna limit mastering the squat because my movement efficiency is gonna be poor because I can't get into good range of motion to begin with. So this to me is novel. Nobody, when they talk about accessory training, we all think like, how can I isolate these particular muscles? Nobody thinks about access to begin with. So start there, always start there.
Jake, do you wanna kick us off with control?
Yeah, I think it's like Brandon just said. I think Charles Poliquin, strength is gained in the range in which it is trained. Yep. So once you open range of motion, you want to get strong within that range of motion, or we would just say you want stability within that new range of motion. So I did all this stretching, I did all the mobility, I've got an open window. Let's load that open window. That's why I think the loaded stretching that Brandon was talking about is a good bridge, right, to get to that. So let's take my squat, for example, again. I've got some newfound mobility, but if I just start loading that real heavy, I could actually leave myself susceptible for injury. So I want to do some stability work. What does that even mean? Here's a couple of examples. Number one, I could just do isometrics. So I could do loaded isometrics at the bottom of my squat, or we go back to the ring dip. I could actually just do isometrics and do top of ring dip holds, halfway down, all the way in the bottom, and I'm just controlling this newfound range of motion that I have. Or maybe I had the range of motion, I just didn't have stability to begin with. Tempo, man, this is where tempo probably has its biggest benefit. There's a lot of benefits of tempo, talking about muscle endurance training. We used to think it was important for hypertrophy, maybe not so much anymore. But this is where just adding some slow eccentrics and even concentrics and pauses in different positions work really well. Go back to the ring dip example. I can do a nice 3-second negative all the way to the bottom of the ring dip. And you know what, if I lack a lot of stability, I can even do a slow concentric coming up. Is that gonna limit how many reps I can do and how much load I can move? Absolutely, but that's not the point. The point is to build control or stability. Last two is unilateral. Unilateral training or single arm, single leg training is really gonna have a tremendous benefit for, again, creating control and creating stability. One of the first examples, again, that pops in my head here too would be something with a bench press. I love like incorporating sometimes the off season for some of my athletes, like single arm bench pressing, right? Single arm overhead pressing. Again, even with nice and slow tempos. I always want to go off on benching. Everybody should bench more. We should just do it a lot more. Unilateral training will have its place in a couple different areas, but it's especially good for creating stability and control as well. Brandon, would you
Yeah, I think the big thing, and because I've fallen into this trap before, I gained some new access, and Jake already talked about this with his squat. Like, let's say I improved my access in my squat or my overhead position, and then immediately I'm like, I feel pretty good, so now I'm gonna load it heavy. So now I go to that 400-pound squat, and I'm doing these progressions, and then all of a sudden I'm tweaky again. So this is a really good place to start Once you improve your mobility, do some control or stability-based work to strengthen those in ranges. The way that a joint works is you're gonna be weakest in the in range and you're gonna be strongest kind of in that middle range. And so we have to strengthen the in range so you're safe for the sport. And it actually is gonna help you move better, and you're gonna be more enduring when we get to this final piece of the puzzle, which is kind of mastery of the movement. And again, that's what we're aiming for. All of this is kind of the bottom of the pyramid so that you can get to the goals that you have at the top of the pyramid. So keep that in mind. That kind of leads us then to that last piece. So let's just say we go through our accessory work, we're trying to improve some mobility for an athlete, we do that, we improve stability for the athlete, then we can get to this mastery side. And I think most people don't really think about accessory work when they think about mastery, but I think about how can I get someone really moving well and then have really good endurance in some of these positions that we don't usually think about for something like a handstand push-up or a back squat or an overhead squat. So the question that I always ask myself when I'm looking at mastery is, what is the weak link? And I think a good example of this, Jake, maybe is just like talking about a strict handstand push-up, right?
Yeah.
We see athletes that can't do a strict handstand push-up, and some people struggle with getting their head off the ground. Like they get to the ground or an ab mat maybe if they're starting there, and they just like cannot move their body. Other athletes may struggle with the lockout position. Like they can actually press off the ground pretty quick, but then all of a sudden the lockout is poor. We need to ask ourselves, well, where is the weak link in that chain? Because we know the pattern, they both suffer with poor handstand push-ups, but they may have two different limitations within the parts of that pattern. So Jake, you want to kind of talk about that?
Yeah, it kind of bleeds into functional anatomy, which is the first point that we had here. It's you do have to have, if you're going to program for yourself, or you're helping somebody else out in their training, some basic understanding of anatomy, right? We're political science majors, right? So like we didn't take anatomy physiology class. You just pick it up over the years and years of coaching and working with people and asking the question, what is the weak link here? So go back to the handstand push-up example. If I know that the function of the tricep is to extend the elbow, and I'm having trouble locking out at the top of my handstand push-up, it's probably going to be a tricep limitation there, right? If I know that in my pull-up, and you have an athlete doing strict pull-ups or you struggle with strict pull-ups, I'm actually pretty good about kind of getting halfway up, and then I have trouble again finishing at the top. I know that the function of my upper back is to retract the scapula, right, and actually get my chin up over the bar. Or, you can kind of start looking at movements that way, and then kind of go to the next point here where we're looking at parts versus patterns. Brandon, actually jump in, and you're the one who wrote that part down, so yeah, I think it's kind of segueing into what I was just talking about.
I mean, it's
there.
exactly what Jake's just talking about. Is like, first, I really actually like seeing the full pattern. Right? Yeah. I want to see someone's full squat or someone's full strict handstand push-up, or to Jake's point, someone's full pull-up, and then we start breaking it down into parts. Because again, there's always going to be a weak link in the chain. So you got this full pattern, the pull-up, the handstand push-up, the back squat, but then we notice that there's one weak part to it. Instead of training the entire pattern, which we can do maybe 1 or 2 times a week, in our accessory work, we want to start to isolate the weak link in that full pattern. So that's what we mean by parts versus patterns. If you want to get better at something like a strict handstand push-up, you can just do strict handstand push-ups, but you're going to be limited on what you actually can achieve. If we break it down into, okay, we're going to work on arm extension or strengthening the triceps, your delts, making sure that we're getting stronger off the bottom. If we're doing all those little pieces together, then we can actually get them better at the full movement faster, and they're going to build better movement quality and more endurance over the long haul.
I think to add one thing too, this is where I do think that it might be a little redundant, functional anatomy, but it's helpful because what we're trying to communicate there is you don't have to be an expert at anatomy. If you're an athlete coaching and training yourself, man, you don't have to dive super deep into this. If you're like, oh, my deadlift sucks. Okay, where does it suck at, right? Like, do you have trouble locking out on the deadlift, or do you have trouble pulling the deadlift off the floor to begin with? A lot of people can get the bar off the floor and they can't lock out. Well, if you just start understanding very, very basic anatomy, like, okay, if I have trouble locking out my deadlift, ChatGPT, what muscles is working there, right? Like it could be that simple. Okay, well, hey, that's primarily going to be my glutes, which aid in hip extension, right? Okay, cool. What happens if I isolate my glutes, and how can I choose exercises that are going to actually be a hip extension exercise and help me lock out the top of the deadlift? If it's from the bottom of the floor, if it's a little bit more quad, right? The quad extends the knee. So you don't have to go on these deep dives and be a professional coach or go to school for anatomy and phys. Like, it could be pretty simple. And I think that starts with what Brandon is saying with parts and patterns. Look at the whole pattern and then break it into its constituent parts, and then ChatGPT the rest.
Yeah.
I'm not even kidding.
ChatGPT is great. I just want to overemphasize that point that it is if you can start to identify where the actual weak link is, it makes it so much easier to get someone better, including yourself. If you're just like writing programming for yourself, or you're adding in some accessory work on top of the program that you follow. And I think the mistake that most coaches make is they just are doing the patterns all the time.
Yeah.
I suck at deadlifts, I'm just gonna do deadlifts. But to Jake's point, like if you can't get full hip extension at the top and you're never working on your glutes and hip extension, then you're always gonna be limited and you're more susceptible to injury, which happens a lot in CrossFit when you have to do 50 deadlifts for time in a workout. So that's kind of a really important part to this puzzle of making sure that you're identifying those kind of weaker links within a full pattern.
Let me rant on the last point. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, this thing fires me up. If you've been to a Mayhem performance coaching camp, you'll know that I'll talk about this all the time. I just see this way too often with athletes. We don't go hard enough in our accessory training, right? There's not enough intensity.
Wait, we're supposed to go hard in that?
Yeah. Like, I mean, so you think, let's give me a handstand. Okay, we'll go handstand push-up. You're like, all right, well, hey, I have trouble locking in on a handstand push-up. So I'm going to add some seated dumbbell French press or tricep extensions, right? And a lot of athletes will do 10 reps for 3 sets, and here's what their 10th rep looks like, okay? Is that going to really overload the tricep in a way that's going to add enough intensity so the body has to respond in a way that's going to build muscle endurance with the tricep? Obviously, no, it's a rhetorical question, right? So it's like, it's just the point of going, hey, when you're doing your accessory work, train, you don't have to train to failure all the time, but close to it, right? Like add the same intent and intensity with your accessory training as you do with your primary pieces, like your handstand push-up, your work you're doing that day, or the heavy back squats you're doing, or heavy deadlifts, whatever it may be. I just think a lot of people don't yield good results or outcomes from accessory work because, again, it goes back to the original problem. We're kind of going full circle here. They don't understand the purpose, they don't value it enough, and they're not going hard enough in it when they're doing it. They're not being intentional with it. So
sweet. Yeah. To wrap it up, we would encourage you to kind of follow this framework if you're writing for yourself, or again, you can always hire a Mayhem performance coach, but using this framework of access, control, and mastery in all your accessory work will help you become a better athlete.